So for my Digital Humanities consultation, my site here, Barragona's Literary Resources, provides resources on the study of English literature, except they don't really have a good definition of what English literature is, because we've got Dante and we've got several American authors in here. And even when you redefine English literature to only be literature written in English territories, they really only hit the highlights here. Shakespeare, Beowulf, Chaucer gets a lot of attention. And then we usually in our two sections here, hit the typical dead white guys, Shelley, Byron. So here in my timeline, I want to provide a kind of neater way to look at English literature in context and another way to study it, but then also cover some of the less talked about voices. And by doing this, I redefined English literature to specifically be literature written in English-controlled territories, not just England. Because when the English came in, took over a place, and a lot of times made them learn English and instead banned whatever the local language was, they then would oftentimes not consider the writings of authors in those locations as good. So here I want to talk about English literature written in English territories. And since there was a lot of them, we're going to specifically talk about India. So here I split my timeline into 4 major parts. So, and three of these are for context, and then one is actual texts that were written in India or by Indians, but in English because I don't read Bengali or Hindi. So here we have literary periods, which were the very Western-centric ways in which literature was defined into specific categories of themes and ideas, both to contrast how Indian literature did not fit into them and how it did oftentimes fit into them. And then here is the current government, because the British control of India was split into 2 distinct phases. We have here the Company Raj, which is controlled by the British East India Company. And then we have the British Raj, which was controlled by the actual British Crown. So, and this came about due to an act of Parliament. And that's what these major historical events are. So we have the Battle of Plassey, and then the several following battles, which led to the British East India Company annexing and taking control of most of what is now India and Pakistan. And then we had the India Rebellion, which was when large amounts of people in India rose up against the British East India Company, and then large amounts rose up in defense. And it was about 1.5 years of violence that led to the Government of India Act, in which the British government came in, liquidized the British East India Company, and took control of Britain under the Crown. So Queen Victoria was named the first Empress of India. And this ran for another 100 years until the partition of India, in which India was broken up into India and Pakistan, and which is how it is these days. And then there's a lot of famines, because in my research I discovered that there was at least 14 recorded famines under British control of India, so which is horrifying. I got a little distracted learning about all of the famines that occurred. And then down here we have our actual text. So the Travels of Deen Muhammad was the first known Indian book to be published in English. Travelogues were very popular at the time, but this is actually a travelogue of India written by an Indian instead of just some white guy coming in and talking about how weird it is. And then the first known English novel written by an Indian. So this author, I'm not going to even try to say his name, was very prolific, but he mainly wrote, of course, in Bengali, which was, I assume, his first language. And this may actually go along with the literary period, because while Romanticism was known for its emphasis on emotional poetry, the Victorian period brought the novel back into prominence over poetry. And then we have some later ones, which I assume the British East India Company was not so interested in educating people. The British Raj probably considered it their duty to civilize and educate the Indians, of course. So we probably saw more people studying and learning English, whether they liked it or not. Here we have Sultana's Dream, which is the first Indian English science fiction piece written by a Muslim Indian woman. And you'll notice all of these have full text on them. I found full text for all but the last one, and I made them accessible here. So if somebody comes here looking to study Indian English literature, well, your texts are right there. So Tagore was a Bengali writer, and he was very prolific. He wrote in both Bengali and English, and anything he wrote in Bengali, he usually translated into English himself. He was a Nobel Prize winner, but then after he won the Nobel Prize, the prize itself was stolen, and he received a knighthood from King George, but then renounced it in protest of British abuses. So, but he was considered a very great Indian thinker and polymath towards the end of British rule, and he's basically like Gandhi, but not as well known and not as problematic that we know of. And then here we have two pieces from Mukherjee, who was the first Indian author to win a literary award in the US, because he lived in the US in the last part of his life. And here is one of his early poetry collections, Songs of Twilight. And here we have one of his children's books. The award he won was a Newbery Medal because he was a children's book author. And it's Gaynek, the story of a pigeon, which is about a Indian boy and his pigeon who end up serving in World War I and get very badly traumatized. I suppose children's books were probably way different back in the 1920s. And that is my prototype. So we've already seen a lot of this from Adrian's fantastic presentation in class on Friday, but I wish I'd figured out stands better so I could, because it's sometimes hard to see where things end. Luckily, most of these things run end to end, so there's not like gaps, and then it would be really interesting to see this with other British colonies, but that was way too much for me to handle on this one project. So hope you liked it.